Start right on.
Okay.
Hi, so I had a question
Yes.
before everybody else gets on. um, I did receive the messages. I know I submitted my takeaways from the last two courses to you and Barbara. But I received another message, not to do it as an attachment. So I sent it to Donna Lisa. Hey, Donna Lisa. Yes.
Hi.
So
Yes.
yes, I just sent it to her. But I was also seeing, how can I get an advisor?
Okay. Well, we're about to start. I will send, but you can do that through us. You can do that through SBDC. You can do that through SCORE, or if you had a personal mentor that should have gone out in something earlier on, just let us know how you want to do that or where.
Yes, I would like to get one from you guys.
Okay.
So I'll just email you, Tracy.
Okay, great. Yeah, or just put that in submittable.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Okay, enjoy tonight.
Thanks.
Okay, well, it looks like it is 6 o'clock. So welcome everyone. We want to get this started since we're so close to the holiday. I'm glad all of you are here tonight. So we have with us tonight Donna Lisa Stinyard. She is our Associate Director. She will help monitor questions in the chat. So if you have any for our speaker, you can put those in there. She'll also be monitoring Facebook as well. So if there are any questions on there. So for those of you that aren't familiar with us, the Center for Women Entrepreneurs is part of the larger Jane Nelson Institute for Women's Leadership, which is dedicated to preparing more women to take on successful roles in business and public service to ensure women have the education to establish careers as successful C-suite executives, skills for building entrepreneurial businesses, and the framework needed to run for public office. Besides, our center is the Center for Student Leadership and the Center for Women in Politics and Public Policy. We're glad all of you are here tonight. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to introduce our speaker for tonight. Great news is this is just picking up more and more. Kelly, we have so many more than just our grant winners joining in on the small business training course. So I'm pleased to introduce our speaker tonight. Kelly Trager is a transactional attorney licensed in Texas, New York, and Illinois, helping individuals and organizations with their legal and business needs. She is also an assistant professor of professional practice in the Department of Entrepreneurship and Innovation at the Neely School of Business at TCU, and an associate adjunct professor in the graduate departments of Design Management and Arts and Cultural Management at Pratt Institute in New York. She is a former professional dancer. Kelly saw that brilliant innovators were often intimidated by the legal and business aspects of their work and decided to help fill that gap. An entrepreneur with her own firm, www.kktlaw.com, and an augmented reality art tech business. Sounds really interesting. Artfully, she understands the needs of the business owner and has the attorney's toolbox to get things done. Kelly, we are so happy to have you here tonight.
Well, thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here, and it is wonderful to see so many, boxes and names here on this holiday week to talk about the thing that we are most interested in, and that is business entities. Who doesn't love that? So it is important, and I will try and make it as fun and as exciting as possible, along with a number of takeaways for all of you grant recipients and everyone who's just joining to be part of, to getting more information and learning a lot. So, I know I understand that we will have a varying level of skill and sort of background in talking about different types of business forms. So, if you have questions, obviously you are to put them in the chat. I will also stop sort of midway and do a check-in. If something is really pressing, you can, sort of wave your hand or your virtual hand rather, and say, I don't know what you're saying to me right now. And I will go back. In addition to that, I have a slide deck that I'm going to share that sort of has some of those takeaways that I will, of course, share with everybody. So I will send that along to be sent out to everyone who is participating today. Again, I've tried not to make it overly cumbersome as we go through a number of different entities. And I'm going to attempt to break this down into different business forms and talking about those things in terms of 1, ease, 2, taxation, and 3, liability, because those are the things that we most care about when we're thinking about how to protect not only our business, but the assets within it, and figuring out how to identify and sort of put value on those assets. So for that reason, I guess we will jump right in, and I will share my slide deck. So again, I thank you to people who are helping to monitor that chat, and please, because I won't be able to see everybody, feel free to jump in and interrupt me as need be. So here we go. Everyone can see that? Yeah. Okay, great. So here we are. We're not just talking about formation, but we're talking a little bit about classification and sort of procedure and governance, a little bit of hopefully a coverall for all of these different types, or our main types of entities, and sort of some of the concerns, some of the pros and cons, and as I said, trying to break that down into ease, taxation, and liability, so you can think about what fits best, some of the concerns moving forward. So, okay, so here are the basics that first and foremost we need to know. Any type of business that you form, like a contract, right? And all of you will have a ton of contracts moving forward. You'll be both on the receiving end of contracts and on the giving end of contracts, but everything there is governed by state law. And so the state law can make a difference in what type of entity you want to form, where you want to have your business. But most important to know that it's a state law question, even though, of course, we know the 2 things in life we cannot avoid are death and taxes take the form of state, local, and federal. So we'll have a couple of little sprinklings thrown in there too. But for the most part, we're dealing with state law, right? So when I try and figure out where, which state do I choose? Obviously, the first thing, if we're talking first and foremost about ease, are we sensing a theme here? Where you are located, right? It is easiest to get through and manage your business where you actually are. That makes a lot of sense, I hope. The next one is where tax laws are more favorable. So taxation, right? And then where you will be headquartered, or where you will have a significant presence, which speaks again a little bit to ease. But if you are not located, but you know that you're going to have a significant presence somewhere else, you can think about sort of that from a liability standpoint. So in addition to that, I have to, when I form a more formal entity, and asterisk, we'll come back to that in a second, when I'm also doing business in other states or other jurisdictions, I will have to be recognized as a business, an entity doing business in that state, which means I'll probably also have to make some filings in that state. If I'm a corporation, if I'm an LLC, or if my name is taken in another state, for example. And of course, as we get in and we keep moving into a more and more global world, the question becomes, what happens with e-commerce? How do I decide what state I really am in if I'm all over the place, if I'm not only in states, but if I'm international as well? And so part of that is the test for that are what's called sufficient minimum contacts. And if we know anything about, well, and we know everything's about laws in the United States. We have 50 states, and therefore we have 50 different laws, right? And federal law and additional things. So every state also might have a little bit of a different rule about what constitutes sufficient minimum contacts. Is it a sufficient minimum contact, for example, if I just sell to somebody who is a resident of that state online? Or do I need something more? Do I need something where I do targeted advertising to people in that jurisdiction as well as doing sales? And then in addition to that, if I'm working in e-commerce at all, there is the question of sales tax collection. Sometimes if I have to collect sales tax for purposes of do I have sufficient minimum contacts in that state, that might work, right? That might be the same thing to a state attorney general or legislation. So these are all things we need to think about. Now, the good news is there are great, easy software that is available now to deal with sales tax liability. If I'm doing something that is online, where do I need to collect sales tax? How does that get done? How do I calculate that for online platforms? And that is a big change, right? That is a huge advancement that makes all of our lives a lot better and easier. But it is something that we need to consider again as we start to expand and if we're dealing with online transactions. So far, so good? Yeah. Okay. The next thing I need to mention, again, these are sort of the basics before we get into the nitty-gritty. EIN numbers. Again, I know we have a whole different range of levels here. An EIN number is something that you should have for your business. It is like the social security number for your business. It is a tax employer identification number. And so depending on the type of entity you are, you may or may not need it. I always sort of advise having one because it is easier. It helps you separate, even if you're a sole proprietor, it helps you separate things out. And as you start to hire people, which you can, regardless of entity type, you want to have an employer identification number. So it's clear what's happening in terms of the business paying taxes for its employees. The good news about an EIN number, again, is it is free and it is instant, right? You can just go to irs.gov and get your EIN number. You'll have to answer questions about your business, what type it is, what you do, right? What industry it's in, but you can get that EIN number instantly. And I'll speak more about that a little bit later as we get into different, as we talk about corporations and LLCs specifically. But I've also made a note on this deck that there are lots of sites. If you just do your basic sort of Google search and look for EIN, you will have a number of sites that are sort of business companies that will help you, quote unquote, help you with those filings for the low fee of $20 or $40 or whatever it is. What you need to know is you don't need to do that. You can go directly to the site and get it instantly. And again, as you are going through formation and maintenance, that is going to be essentially your number for everything, including getting a bank account, right? That is one thing. And different banks are different in terms of what they require for a bank account. And I'll come back to that in a second, but that's a really important thing. So that is your EIN number. And then, of course, regardless of entity type, there's another filing, a DBA. And some of you may already use a DBA, right? If you have a business that is a sole proprietorship, for example, and you are operating under a business name rather than your own personal name, you may have filed a doing business as already. This can be useful, again, even if I'm already incorporated and it turns out I go through a rebrand and I need to change my name. So I need to just make it clear that I'm the same company with the same EIN number, perhaps, but I'm also now operating under another name. So that becomes important. Another reason that I might have to file a doing business as is if I'm applying to be recognized in another state other than my initial state of I'm going to default to saying incorporation, even if that is not your entity type. I'm going to default to saying that. So if I apply to do for recognition in another state, doing business as, because it may be that in that state, there's already a company with my same name. So in order to avoid confusion, it is possible that my business, even though I operate as one thing, will need to, for tax purposes in another state, file as a doing business as, right? So that is a tax issue primarily, or recognition issue primarily. But going backwards even from that, thinking about, again, as we are going through and figuring out our branding for our companies, for our products and services, I see a number of clients who have their hearts set on this name, right? I'm so sure that this is the right product name. I'm so sure that this is the right company name. And they go, and it turns out that their domain name isn't available. And that sounds, again, super basic, but you'd be surprised the number of people who don't think about going to look at, a domain purchase service like a GoDaddy or a Namecheap or whatever it may be, to do that diligence to say, okay, well, can people find me? The other thing for our purposes, for business names, is that if the domain name isn't available, chances are the company name is not available in some way, shape, or form. And so before I get too far down the road of, spending time, money, and energy investing in this branding, this company that I can't really do anything with, I have to sort of figure out another name anyway. I want to make sure that I'm there, and that I have something that is mine, that people can find me, that is easy. I know that we are not talking about intellectual property today, but I do a lot of IP work. And so it's also a good first step when we're talking about trademark law and trademarking. One more sort of quick aside about that is that, again, people sort of form their businesses, think about, okay, do I want to be an LLC? Do I want to be a corporation? What am I? And then the next thing they say is, I need to trademark this name straight away. And maybe, but maybe not. And maybe not because, again, do I want to spend time, money, and energy right now with the limited resources I may have as a startup in going to a registration? Because the touchstone for trademark is use in commerce. So I need to make sure that I have my product out there, that I have my name out there, and that I'm getting that name recognition, which sort of serves as the base for starting before I trademark. Now, as we go through and we're looking at asset identification, we know that intellectual property is a huge way to identify assets, right? That they're quantifiable, but trademark potentially has a ton of value. If I'm Nike, my trademark has a ton of value. But if I'm doing business as KKT Law and only the people who know me, it doesn't necessarily mean that I have to run out and trademark first and foremost. That may become important, but I probably have a little bit of time and space. The use in commerce is sort of the baseline for that. And so that's just, again, a little bit separate and apart from straight up entity formation, but those two things are connected when I'm thinking about naming and sort of branding in the long run. So we can jump into, again, our sort of first, our basics, right? So our first type that I want to talk about is a sole proprietorship, right? A sole proprietorship means you are on your own, you're doing something, and you haven't done anything in terms of filing any paperwork with any state whatsoever, right? Obviously, we have, if we're looking at this in terms of ease, taxation, liability, the easy thing is a lot of people start as a sole proprietorship, right? This is, or a side hustle, or your very first job you ever had if you were a babysitter, or you mowed lawns, or you did something like that. You were a sole proprietor, whether or not you knew it at, the ripe old age of 14 or 15, right? You were a sole proprietor. For our purposes, as we move forward, as we're starting to look at whether or not our product or service sort of fills that gap in the market, right? Is our value proposition, can we prove it? The good thing about a sole proprietorship is I don't have to do a lot. right? Easy entrance and exit from the market. I can see if there's any there. There's no formal filing to be done. I don't have to tell the state that I'm a formal business, even though I probably think of myself as a formal business. And again, it's a low risk. Obviously, if I'm working on my own, I have total control of that business. That also means, in terms of taxation, that any income coming in is taxed to me as personal income. So the only reporting obligation that I really have is to report any income that I make from that sole proprietorship, just as if I would report my income if I were an employee of a company, right? So I can take those losses also on my personal income tax if I'm putting money into my business and essentially I'm not making a profit yet. I can take those losses to offset any other income that I may have. So that's a taxation sort of advantage and, just sort of administrative matter. And then from a liability standpoint, this is where things come into play. Now, I say that I don't have to tell the state that I'm doing anything. There are some exceptions for things like, again, if I'm a professional, if I'm lawyering, I have to prove that I'm licensed to lawyer in that state, whether or not I'm a corporation or a sole proprietor. Or if I'm in food business, right? Anything that has sort of other obligations, regardless of the entity type, that requires maybe some other licensing, but I can still be a sole proprietor to do that. The downside to sole proprietorships, of course, is that personal liability. In the same way, I take any income is taxed as personal income. Any losses that come from that business or any liability that I incur if something goes wrong is personal liability, which means they can come after my personal assets, my car, my house, etc. Now, this obviously is a scary prospect, a big downside to a sole proprietorship. And again, many people are sole proprietors for a short time until they become something else. It is sort of that initial stomping ground or testing ground. And so in addition to that, I'm not sort of just left out in the wild, right? I can absolutely mitigate that risk of personal liability with insurance. There's always insurance. Lawyers love insurance. So you'll hear me say that a couple times tonight, probably, because we are inherently risk averse. But of course, we should be a little risk averse if we're thinking about personal liability that might incur. Now, I can get insurance. The thing that we need to know with both the sole proprietorship and our next entity, the partnership, is that that insurance cost might be slightly more expensive because I'm insuring a business as an individual rather than as an entity. Even if, right, if I form a corporation and it's just me, I'm the sole shareholder, there's sort of just, it's really paperwork that is the difference between whether or not I'm a corporation or an individual. The business is essentially running the same way on the day-to-day. But from an insurance standpoint, that additional layer of formality may show that, again, that is a lower risk than a sole proprietorship. That is not always the case, but more often than not, we see just a little bit of a cost differential. And again, that cost may be absolutely worth it if I don't know if there's any there yet in my business. And I need to figure out, right, I need to do some validation on what I'm trying to do. So that's always an option, but definitely one I need to tell you all. Okay, I'll do one more and then I will sort of stop my screen share and make sure we're all together or take some questions beforehand. So the next thing is partnership. And we have a couple of different types of partnerships, but the default partnership and the one that we sort of all know and love is the general partnership. And that just means there are two or more people doing the same thing together. Again, we haven't done any sort of formal government filing. We haven't said anything. The default in a general partnership, in the absence of anything else, is that we have shared control, we have shared liability. We share profits and losses equally, unless there is something, unless there is a contract, essentially, that changes that default. Generally, the default also is that a partnership is dissolved when one partner dies. Again, we can have paperwork to change that default and figure out what happens. if we're going to act in some other way. But because a partnership essentially is not as formal of an entity as other entity types we have that essentially have their own existence, so to speak, that's why we have that, why we see that dissolution. So in terms of ease, taxation, liability, essentially the same rules in the default general partnership apply to a sole proprietorship. In addition to that, we have to think, what are some additional pitfalls? Additional pitfalls are, as we all probably know very well, anytime we work with another person or people, right, there are interpersonal dynamics in play. There are questions about whether or not we share the same values or have the same vision for the next year, 3 years, 5 years. And I always love to tell a story about two partners who were coming in to my office, and we were talking about sort of how to structure what their agreement was. Is it a general partnership? What are we gonna do here? And I said, okay, I have this sort of list of questions for us to run through, because again, a partnership is a relationship. So like any other relationship, we want to have those tough conversations while everybody's still in love, right? Because afterwards, nobody's talking about anything, let alone whether or not my, let's say, 70% cash investment is worth the same value-wise as your sweat equity, right? And that's a question I see most often. Does money and effort really have equal value in everybody's mind? So something to think about. And that is true, I think, regardless of the entity type. That's just sort of basic, again, partnership dynamics or interpersonal dynamics within a business. So these two partners were talking, and we were running through the list of questions. And one of those is, where do you see this business in 5 years? And one of them, one of the partners was like, I see that we have brought on X number of employees and we've grown and we've expanded our market. And I see that we're running this, but we've been able to grow enough to delegate. Great. Sounds perfect. The other partner said, well, I'd like to be retired and on a beach somewhere. Well, okay, that's great. Theoretically, that means they're seeing the same sort of growth or potential in the business, but practically that means something really, really different, right? Me being on a beach means I'm probably not working in the day-to-day of the business. And so how do we structure that to make sure that everyone can sort of get what they want? And is that what we both had envisioned when we were talking about this and all excited about it, 2 months ago? So always something to think about. I list it sort of as an additional potential pitfall, because a lot of times, and most often, these two ladies were friends beforehand, right? And so we have a tendency as humans to say, oh, you know what? We're both on the same page. We're friends, so it's going to be fine. Please don't do that, right? It is not going to be, maybe it will be fine. Maybe I'm wrong, but more often than not, I see that sort of that communication breakdown happens early, and we both let things slide because of our personal relationship. And then we get to a place in the business where we're unhappy and we're unable to communicate that unhappiness. So we have two things here. The next part of this is we have an actual legal fiduciary duty to the partnership. So again, we are supposed to both act, or I'm again defaulting to 2 people instead of more than 2 people, but it's equally true no matter how many partners we have in here, right? We have to ensure that we are sort of paddling the canoe in the same direction, right? We are both acting in the best interest of the business, and we're working for the benefit of the partnership. We're acting in good faith, and we're disclosing all material facts about the partnership. So if I have a potential deal, like I can't just sort of say, okay, I got to wait for that to come to fruition, because again, the default is that we have an equal say in the management and sort of the direction of that partnership. So now I've said we don't, as a partnership, need to have any formal filings with the state. That is true, 100%. In the same way as I have sole proprietorship, right? Income that comes to the partnership, we need to declare individually on our personal income. That's generally how that goes. But here's where I introduce, right, a contract like any other, and that is the partnership agreement. Some states call it the Articles of Partnership. Essentially what it is a contract between the partners that essentially does all of the stuff of laying out the roles and responsibilities, and has sort of the outcome of all of those difficult conversations or potentially difficult conversations. This is also what I call an internal document, because again, it doesn't need to be filed with the state as a partnership. It is hopefully everything goes great and it never sees the light of day outside of the partners. But should something go wrong, then you have a document to sort of back up what was happening and what the agreement was about, especially if there's some split in profits that is other than that 50-50 default, right? If it's 70-30, well, now I definitely need to have an agreement to tell me what that is and how we're valuing all of the things. So again, it is an internal contract that if everything goes right, only the partners see, but it helps memorialize what is happening should something go wrong. Or it gives us, like any of the other documents that we will be talking about, sort of gives us a roadmap for what to do as we move forward. So that is the general partnership. And that is the partnership that we most often think of, right? That default, again, equal split for assets and liabilities. So I want to mention also a limited partnership. And a limited partnership is something that we see less and less frequently as we have other entity types to come in to replace it. But there is a thing that sort of starts to move us toward the more formal governance of the entity that we may be running. And that is essentially for purposes of generally investors come in, right? Or we have an investment, and it works best in this case for generally something that is a short-term project. So this is not sort of a long haul, but if we have a joint venture of some sort that we have somebody else who's coming in to throw some money at, for example, we may see a limited partnership. And I say it gets us more to that sort of formal side of things because again, I need to, in a limited partnership, have at least one general partner. And that general partner means I have to have somebody left holding the bag if something goes wrong, right? The limited partner comes in and essentially is only on the hook for the amount of money that he or she or they or the company, whatever it may be, comes in and invests. I'm only on the hook for my investment. And beyond that, the general partner is the one that incurs the remainder of the liability. So because I am giving limited liability to at least one party in this deal, I then have to file a more formal agreement, and that is an agreement of limited partnership. Essentially, it's a very basic document, but it tells the state who the general partner is should something go wrong, who the limited partner is, and what that amount is of investment. And the trade-off there is the limited partner, sometimes also known again as the silent partner, comes in, but cannot be responsible for the day-to-day management, right, of the partnership or the operation. And that makes sense from a policy perspective, right? I can't say, okay, I'm not going to be responsible for anything, but I'm also going to tell you how to run your business, and probably, poorly if we get to a point where we're having an issue. So that is something, again, we're seeing less and less, but it works well for short-term projects, short-term investments. And that gives us another thing. Then you may also see an LLP, a limited liability partnership. Fun fact for your holiday tables, right? It was first recognized in the great state of Texas in 1991. Yay. That will probably not come up at your Thanksgiving tables, but you never know. Sometimes there's a lull in conversation and you can throw in a fun party fact. So here again, the LLP was sort of this experimental thing that is generally for professional organizations. We see this for a lot of law firms, and essentially it limits is this hybrid where it limits liability for claims to the assets of the partnership as a whole, but it doesn't let us get to personal assets. But it's still not a separate entity. So it's like the limited partnership. Essentially, it's just this for professional organizations. And we'll see a couple of those entity types. Yeah. And I have this, I'm in the interest of time, I'm not even going to go into these, but again, I will share this slide deck with you so that you can see sort of these other things. If this is an entity type that you are involved in or interested in learning more about, I'm happy to talk offline after this. They exist, but we're not going to go into that. So for a second, I'm here, I'm going to stop my share and just do a check-in and see how we're all doing. Again, if you have questions, if there are some questions that have come up so far, I am more than happy to take those before we continue.
So we did have a few questions in the chat. Somebody asked, are you going to tell us how to file the DBA?
Yes, it is pretty simple and straightforward on most states' websites, and every state is a little different. In Texas, there is the division of businesses essentially, and there is a special form for a DBA, which essentially is straightforward. And I'm pretty sure in Texas you can file it online. Most states you can file it online directly and submit it rather than having to deal with an office or things like that. But you can Google DBA Texas, for example, and it will take you to the state website. And generally, I've found surprisingly state websites for these types of entities are pretty good about walking you through that process, especially if you can submit them online.
Okay, great. She said, thank you.
Great.
If I started and filed an LLC business in Missouri, but moved to Texas, do I have to do anything different in the new state?
Yes. And I will get to that. I'm getting to corporations and LLCs. But the short answer is if you have moved and you are essentially basically doing business primarily now in the state of Texas, you can do one of two things. You can dissolve the Missouri entity and reform in Texas, or you can just apply for recognition in Texas as what is called a foreign entity. And while foreign normally means from another country, for purposes of business entity formation and maintenance, it just means it was formed in another state and is now operating in this state. So there are forms, again, that same site that says, recognition of a foreign entity in Texas. Just essentially the Attorney General oversees business operations of all businesses, LLCs, corporations, and theoretically these informal partnerships, et cetera. And so they want to know that one, you're properly paying taxes, especially if you're a corporation, right? And two, that they have oversight over businesses that are working here in Texas, so that if there are complaints or problems or lawsuits that come up, they know how to find you.
Great. So then we also had, if you have an EIN, do you need a DUNS number?
It depends on the industry that you're in. Sometimes and we often see DUNS numbers if you are in the process of applying for grants or funding. Sometimes grantors will request that you have a DUNS number as well. But the EIN number is essentially that social security number. The DUNS number will give more information about industry specifically. And again, a lot of times if I'm applying for grants or funding, that's where that will come up. And that does take a little bit more time. So if you think that you're going to be applying for funding or grants, you may want to do that sooner rather than later. Better to sort of do it and not need it as quickly than have the opposite where you're up against a deadline and you need some more time.
Okay, great. Are you going to go more in depth with the LLC? Because I've got a couple of those questions.
Yes, I am. That is, I'm getting there. I'm going from least formal to most formal. So yes.
Okay. So I'm going to hold the LLC questions to see if maybe they get answered.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah. And so I think we're good to keep going.
Okay, fantastic. I will go back to sharing and we will get to our more formal entities. Okay, we're back. So I'm going to start with the corporation because I think it is a little bit easier to start there and then sort of use that as the comparison point with the LLC. So For a corporation, right, this is what we all know and love when we think about business entity, probably. Corporations, through various court cases, we know are recognized essentially as a person and a citizen. So they essentially have the rights of a person. I like to think about it as when I form a corporation, I essentially have a mini me, right? That is separate and apart from me, the actual human, even if essentially I'm just creating a legal fiction where I am the only shareholder in my corporation. That mini me is me, but mini me can live forever, right? Unless I dissolve it. The default of a corporation is that it has perpetual existence and all the sort of rights of a person. So like everything else, it is formed in one state. And then if I move that corporation or if I'm doing business in another state, it is considered a foreign corporation for attorney general purposes, for business purposes. And that is just sort of one of those legal terms of art that we know means something specific when I'm just talking about a corporation or an LLC. Again, perpetual existence. The sort of the other default characteristic of a corporation is that there are shares of stock, and that is how we determine equity, right? When I form a corporation in a state, each state has a different sort of number of shares that that corporation sort of is granted by coming into existence. In some states, it may be 200. In some states, it may be 500. But that is sort of how I dole out ownership in a corporation as a default. Obviously, if I am the sole shareholder or if I'm the owner of the corporation, I don't necessarily have to issue those shares of stock. I just need to know that they exist sort of, again, by virtue of coming into existence. And so that is sort of, I can change what that default is as well, either when I file or afterwards. But if I change that default, then I'm going to have to pay tax on the shares that are being issued. And again, I can do that later in time if I want to differentiate a different class of shares where people get different voting rights. If I have investors coming in where they get sort of preferential returns, whatever it may be, I have the ability to do it in the future. So if I'm in the process of forming a corporation, don't get bogged down in the, how many shares do I need to do? Unless I know specifically what my plan is for offering shares, I probably don't need to mess with that default straight away. I can always do that later. And that may be a taxable event, again, going back with the state for a new issue, but it is minimal compared to having to manage that at the outset, especially if I don't know the value of my company, right? So I don't need to worry about that. The next thing that we need to say is that every state, no matter what state, generally has an edict in corporate law that says the purpose of a corporation is to maximize profit for its shareholders. Again, if I'm the sole shareholder, I'm the sole owner of my corporation, I'm not going to be sort of bringing a suit against myself for failing to maximize profit, but it's something that we need to know as we sort of expand because we can see problems in the future. Again, at the outset, most of us aren't thinking about that in terms of, will there be a shareholder derivative suit when I, have gone public, whatever it may be, or even for some of in a closely held corporation for some of those people who have a fair amount of equity. But we just need to know that that exists because I'm going to use that statement of corporate law to contrast with a couple of different subtypes of corporation. Right. So that is ease. As we can see, a corporation has a little bit more management. It has a little bit more administration. It's a little more cumbersome overall. Definitely when we get into taxation, right? Mini-me pays its own taxes as well. So now instead of having passed through taxation of those other entities, and in fact, the LLC, which we'll come to next, there is a separate tax return for a corporation because mini-me gets to buy and sell property, gets to sign contracts in its own name, and gets to pay its own taxes. It's like a kid, but the kid is independent from day one, right? Fantastic. So we have that. And then in terms of liability, of course, one of the biggest benefits of a corporation is that it is limited liability to the shareholders. And again, if that is me, and I will use my law firm as an example, right? That is a corporation. I am the sole owner of that corporation. I'm sole shareholder there. So that unless something else happens, which I'll talk about, my liability is limited to the assets of that corporation. Right, so that is the biggest sort of draw to forming one of these more formal entity types. And this seems to not want to move forward. Hold on. There we go. Okay, so again, when I said mini-me, here we see some of those express powers of a corporation, right? Power of perpetual existence, power to sue and be sued in its own name. So the corporation is the one who either sues or there's a lawsuit filed against them, the power to acquire property, make contracts, borrow and lend money, make charitable donations, and to establish rules for managing itself, essentially. So those are the express powers of a corporation. Again, I like to shorthand this to mini-me. Mini-me gets to sort of run itself with my help, of course. But that the existence of mini-me sort of draws that line between me, the human, and me, the corporation, even if, right, I'm the only owner or shareholder. The implied powers here conferred by the statement of corporate purpose. So when I file that document of that certificate of incorporation, which is what the formal document is called, and I'll get to that in a second. Essentially, I want to sort of I want to use the default that most states have now, which is essentially to say for any lawful purpose. So it doesn't limit my ability to, for example, expand my product offerings, right? I don't want to say that my corporate purpose is to sell lemonade, right? And then as my company grows, it's now lemonade and tea and coffee, and lemonade and tea and coffee and cookies, right? And now, do I really want to have limited myself in scope by having to go back and amend that document every time I expand my offerings? So that's something that's a very, again, basic level example of that, but a default in the articles of incorporation in each state, the default says for any lawful purpose. And I find very little reason for almost any business owner to change that to be more specific than less specific, right? And that is in part because, again, here, you don't want to come back and get into trouble if you've acted outside of the scope of your powers because you've limited your powers in that formation document, which is otherwise, again, a very straightforward and simple document. And I've said this again, I'll come back to the filing in a second, but who oversees the corporation's directors and officers? Again, as I get larger, I may have outside help running that corporation. But for the most part, as we're in our startup phase, it is the shareholders, which essentially may just be you. Maybe you and what was formerly a partnership, now you've incorporated and it's 2 of you or it's 3 of you. So again, that you are essentially now shareholders and directors and officers, and thinking about what that means for the day-to-day. The other thing that I've already mentioned is that the Attorney General also has oversight for all corporations that are doing business in that state. Again, should something go wrong, there's always a default that the Attorney General also gets a copy of any paperwork that is filed for litigation purposes. Sometimes, they'll get complaints about the way businesses are running, and then they will start an investigation. And that's how we look into business practices. Obviously, attorney generals have a lot to do. And so it takes sort of a lot of complaints generally to get to that stage. But just knowing that the attorney general also does have oversight for all entities operating in the state, should something go wrong. We have a couple different types of corporations, and I will at the end as well speak a little bit about nonprofits in case we have some social entrepreneurship here and we're talking about nonprofit organizations and sort of how we're running those entities, public or private. So public corporations have sort of specific government functions or duties to fulfill. Most of us are private corporations, right? We are doing our own thing for our own business purpose. Profit or nonprofit, right? The change in the default, if I'm a nonprofit, is there are no shares of stock for a nonprofit organization, and they are owned by no one. Essentially, it is owned by the people, essentially, to sort of fill a gap in them that maybe otherwise the market wouldn't be able to sustain. So that's what we have when we're talking about nonprofits. It's a little bit of a change, but it is still a corporation, even if it's a nonprofit corporation. It has a couple different requirements. And then we are talking about some buzzwords here, domestic. So if I form a corporation in Texas, it is a domestic Texas corporation. If I have formed that corporation in New York and now moved to Texas, or as we heard earlier, Missouri and now moved to Texas, it is a foreign corporation for Texas purposes. And then we use alien corporation if it was formed in another country. So that's how we distinguish between a different state and a different country here. And then again, as we grow, right, everyone has, maybe not everyone has dreams of an IPO, but is it publicly held or closely held? Most of us will be dealing with closely held corporations that have, you want to actually put restrictions on who can join, who can buy in, and who can control the business of the corporation. So again, in most of our situations, closely held corporations are, again, usually run by the shareholders because it is closely held. There may be 2 or 3 of us or 1 of us, however it may go. Or, again, even a family up to 10, right? Okay, I think I saw a question come up already in the chat about this. So the basic type of corporation that I just described, the default is a C Corp. Right? That is sort of what we say. If I do nothing else and I just file a certificate of incorporation, the default is that it will be a C Corp and it will be taxed as such. The S Corp is a specific type of corporation for small corporations and closely held corporations. It has additional restrictions, but it essentially allows me to be treated for tax purposes like a partnership or an LLC. Right, so I can move the corporate losses into, I can take corporate losses on my personal income tax. So it is an element of pass-through taxation. And again, generally a lower, so that allows for a lower rate of tax than through a corporation. And those are some of the advantages there. So again, if it's just me, like, again, I'll use my law firm as the example. It's me where I'm the sole shareholder. It's a professional corporation, which is another layer. But it is an S corporation. So I have a little bit more flexibility there. In addition to that, an S corporation is not filed at the time of formation. It is a tax election. So even though I'm filing my corporate documents, my articles of incorporation with the state where I'm going to incorporate, choosing the S Corp election is a federal tax filing that I send to the IRS. And I don't quote me on it because I don't know that I'm right, but I believe it's Form 5768. That's a little tax nerd stuff for you. Again, I could be wrong on that, but it is an election that I form that I elect when I start to, after I form my corporation in the state. And so the additional limitations on S corporations, you can see, I can't have any more than 100 shareholders. And for most of us, that probably seems like a large number of shareholders, but compared to a giant corporation, it is not, clearly. So no more than 100 shareholders, only individual trusts, and sometimes corporations can be shareholders. I don't want partnerships because that's already sort of a level of taxation that is a pass-through thing that complicates things. So no partnerships can hold shares in an S Corp election. I can only have 1 class of shares. So I can't go through and give sort of different rates of dividends. I can't give different voting rights, whatever I may want to do here. I can only have 1 class of shares for an S corporation. It needs to be a domestic corporation. And in this case, domestic meaning not foreign, meaning United States corporation in one of our states. And no shareholder can be a non-resident alien. So again, if we're going to make it easier for a small corporation to pay taxes, we want to make sure we're collecting taxes because we know they want their taxes. Yeah, so that is a little bit, again, about the specific S Corp election. And again, it's a tax election rather than a separate filing. And I will come back to that as well. Two other things that I want to mention quickly, because you may have seen them out in the world: B corporations. B corporations essentially are a type of corporation. Not all states recognize the B Corp designation. A B Corp is this idea. Remember how I said in every state's corporate law, there is an edict that basically you're supposed to maximize profit. Well, the B Corp, if the state allows for that filing, essentially only allows the corporation to say, look, we're going to look at more things than just profit. And that may mean that we are not always maximizing profit in the eyes of the shareholder, but we're taking into consideration things like environmental sustainability or the well-being of our employees. Those are some sort of designations that we look at. And essentially, to be clear, there is no additional tax benefit for forming as a B corporation, where I'm saying, again, I may take into consideration other things beyond maximizing profit in my business. And what I don't want is shareholders to come after me. And that's all the protection I get. That designated B is basically saying, look, you are on notice as anybody who may be a shareholder that these additional considerations are influencing our business decisions, essentially. There is an additional designation, and this is probably the one that we've seen a little more frequently. The latest example that I can think of is Athleta, right? If you have seen Athleta, you see that they prominently display a B corporation. So Athleta is a subsidiary of the Gap Corporation, which is not a B corporation. But there is a nonprofit organization that essentially allows companies to run through essentially a test for whether or not they meet the standard for to be designated as a B corporation. And this is a little bit different, meaning for advertising and marketing purposes. Right. So they're saying I may be a B corporation in the eyes of this membership through this nonprofit organization that allows me to display this sort of trademark B Corp like Athleta on my marketing materials that says, look, that's going to give me an advantage because people want to buy from a company that cares about people, that cares about women specifically. Right. And sponsors female athletes or, gives back. So that is sort of a branding, trademarking B Corp designation. And in that nonprofit, there's a sliding scale depending on the size of the organization to essentially see whether they meet the standards. They have to re-up every 3 years, so you don't get it forever. But it is essentially like the good housekeeping seal. So there are two different designations. One is a legal designation, and one is, again, a marketing and advertising designation. And they don't necessarily have to have both in order to be out in the world as one or the other. So I just wanted to mention that again, because there are a fair number of them, and not all 50 states recognize that legal version, but we advertise in all. Athleta, for example, advertises in all 50 states with the advertising version. So we have that. And then professional corporations is just when I file, again, it's another layer. If I also need to have to be licensed in that state in order to practice what my trade or craft is, I probably also need to file as a professional corporation so that the oversight ensures that, for example, if I'm holding myself out as a corporation that is a law firm, I am indeed entitled to practice law in that state, right? And so what happens when I form this? So here we are, our step-by-step articles of incorporation. That is that document that gets filed with the state. It is very basic, right? It asks things like, what is the corporate name? What is the corporate address? Am I using this general designation of broad lawful for any lawful purpose? Am I doing the default number of shares? Sign here. Congratulations, you're a corporation, right? So pretty basic that in terms of that filing document. And then what's supposed to happen next, if we have multiple sort of incorporators, right? There's supposed to be a meeting to create the bylaws. And the bylaws are essentially, again, that internal document and roadmap that shows us what's going to happen with the corporation. Again, there are plenty of templates out there for a bylaw, but I also sort of urge everyone to make sure that you read what it says and don't just take a template without knowing what you're sort of getting into, just simply because it is your roadmap. And as you may want to grow and bring people in, you want to make sure that you are clear on what the procedure is for a number of things. You can work with an attorney specifically to craft that, but you can also, again, sit down and think about how can we make sure that the internal document and roadmap matches what my growth plan is, what my vision is for this company. And that's really important. And I have this thing here right after the Articles of Incorporation and before the EIN. Most times, if I'm filing documents for a client, I will do the Articles of Incorporation and EIN at the same time, because for me, those are two filings right on the same day. But I have this all before bank account, because depending on which bank you go to form your to open your corporate account, some banks will request that you have a copy of the bylaws that you submit to them. Again, it varies widely. I haven't seen it too frequently. Generally, it is just the Articles of Incorporation and the EIN number that you need, and some money to open an account. But I have from time to time seen that people needed bylaws to be submitted to that bank in order to get that corporate account. And so every bank's procedure is just a little different, but those are essentially the things that you need to form altogether. Why is it important to do these steps? And again, to have that separate bank account, because there is something called piercing the corporate veil. So if I am not truly acting and separating me from mini me, right, and something goes wrong, there is a possibility, and again, this doesn't happen so often for smaller corporations, but this is where it has the most danger of happening, right? That if I don't properly separate, I don't get the benefit of that limited liability. And if something goes wrong, there may be personal liability that attaches, especially if there aren't a bunch of assets in the corporation itself. Now, again, this is sort of easy to prevent. And one of those things, again, is forming that corporate bank account straight away. Does that mean that I can't, as human Kelly, give mini me Kelly Corporation a loan? Absolutely not. But I just need to document that as such and make sure that I am sort of showing and documenting that those things are separate. It is often the trouble happens, as we've seen with a lot of businesses acting badly, where business accounts are paying for personal assets, cars, homes, vacations, right? Whatever it may be, without that being a business expense, without that documentation. So often we see, again, when personal expenses are paid from the corporate account without sort of a justification for that, that's where we see that most often, but sometimes it can go the other way. So I just always sort of, again, recommend making sure that you document where that money that is passing between personal account and corporate account, even if that is your capital contribution, even if that is a loan to the business, whatever it may be. Because again, so in the United States, interestingly enough, we are one of the few countries that doesn't have a minimum amount of money that that qualifies to essentially capitalize a business. And you can understand that, right? There's a huge swing between me having a brick and mortar business that needs to pay rent and me having a business that essentially is an online business that runs from home that has very little overhead. And so we don't have a set amount of money that needs to be in a corporate bank account in order to form a corporation or to form an LLC, or a lot of countries do. So it's very difficult to justify whether something is adequately capitalized or not. But again, most often we see the problem when it's commingled funds. And just like in partnership, again, the reiteration here, we have a duty of care, loyalty, and obedience to essentially making sure that mini-me and me are actually separate. And I'm not sort of usurping a corporate opportunity for personal gain. And obviously this gets more complicated when I have more people than just me, but not alone. Okay, now finally, as a basis of comparison, here is our LLC. And the LLC is a limited liability company. I'll say that again. It is a limited liability company. Why do I repeat that? Because it is not a corporation, right? It is different, separate and apart from a corporation for a couple of reasons. So if we're looking at ease here, what that state filing document is not an article of incorporation because it's not a corporation. It is an article of organization. So that is sort of one of the differentials. The owners are not shareholders because there are no shares of stock. There's no stock in an LLC generally. And so owners are called members, right? And here, instead of having different classes of stock, in my documents, my internal operating agreement. So in a partnership, that internal document is aptly called a partnership agreement. In a corporation, it is generally called the bylaws. And in an LLC, it is called the operating agreement, right? So that's how we differentiate those things. Again, they're all just the roadmap. They're just called different things. So here we differentiate between members and managing members. So who has control versus who is just sort of an owner in this. One of the complicated things for jurisdiction purposes, if something happens, citizenship of the LLC is based on the citizenship of each member. So I may have a citizen, the LLC is still formed in a state. I may still form in Texas, but let's say I have, comes from a partnership. So there are two of us, one of us lives in Texas, the other one lives in Oklahoma. So for purposes of jurisdiction, if something goes wrong, Texas or Oklahoma, if we have somebody on the other side, they have to be from a different state than either of those for diversity jurisdiction. Again, hopefully we never have that problem. And that's just a little aside that you can say, I hope I never have to know that. But there it is. So the ease of an LLC is there's a little bit of flexibility in management. The other thing about an LLC, it doesn't have that same corporate law edict to maximize profit. So I don't necessarily need to operate continuously in order to retain my LLC status. My corporation goes dormant. You can see that there could be a problem, both from a tax purpose, but also how can I maximize profit if I'm not running a business? The LLC doesn't have that. So it can be dormant. It can sort of be that version where based on my industry, there may be a workflow problem where a bunch of money is going out and then there's a period of time where not much is happening. You can think about maybe making a movie as one of these film productions, right? They get a bunch of money, they spend a bunch of money to make the movie. And then there's this huge period of time between that movie getting made and maybe that movie getting released and money starting to come in. So those are generally LLCs for that purpose. Obviously here in Texas, where we don't have personal income tax, an LLC is a favorable type of entity over a corporation, which a corporation, though it's a mini-me, gets taxed here. And so, I am an attorney, but I always also recommend having an accountant friend or an accountant that you talk to make sure that from a tax liability standpoint, you sort of know where those parameters are for you. The LLC is flexible. You can see this was, again, sort of another experimental format that was somewhere between a partnership and a corporation. I can elect to be taxed as a corporation, as an LLC, or the default is it is passed through taxation as if it's a partnership, but I get the limited liability of a corporation. So my personal assets don't come into play, right? There may be, again, there may be a change in the amount of deductions I can take for business expenses if I choose to have that pass through taxation versus being taxed as a corporation. So that is a taxation sort of question. What is going to be easiest for me? And then from a liability standpoint, again, it's limited liability for members. So it acts as a mini-me, but it's mini-me LLC instead of mini-me Incorporated. And again, fun fact, right? It was a newer hybrid entity. They were like a bunch of, tax people and lawyers sat around and said, let's see if this works. And guess what? It did. So good news. And then just very quickly, I know we have a ton of questions to get through. I promised I would touch on nonprofits. We said, again, no owners. It's owned by the people. There are no shares of stock. And essentially, the difference at the time of filing is I have to, generally in most states, have 3 board members listed at the time of filing. And I fit within those categories of charitable, education, scientific, religious, literary. There are a number of different categories within a 501 subsection of tax. Most often we see a C3, a 501c3, but there are other types as well. And again, some advantages there based on what sort of the government benefits for a corporation that might operate outside of sort of market demand. So my final thoughts, and then I will take all of your questions again. When I'm trying to figure out what I want to be, ease, taxation, and liability elements, right? What is going to make my life easiest? What can I handle right now? And then sort of what are the assets that I need to protect? What is going into that sort of pot, right? Does mini-me hold a bunch of patents, for example? What is my growth strategy? And so what is going to be attractive to investors? Obviously, more formality generally conveys or projects confidence in sort of longevity to investors, but that is not necessarily, that's not obviously not the only factor, but it's one of those things like insurance companies. If I'm looking at a venture, I'm looking at not only what is the growth strategy, how do they feel about their own potential, essentially. And then has there been validation? The other thing, talk to people who've done it, right? You're an LLC? Do you like it? What are your pain points? What are the problems with it? And then, lawyers and accountants. I show the legal side a little bit where I talk more about the liability, and then the accountant sort of talks more again about the day-to-day practicality of taxation and all of that. So again, I will share this deck. This is my contact information, which I'm sure you will all have more questions afterwards. But for now, let's start with the questions you have already.
All right, so let's get through these in the chat. We don't have too many. So we had a question, is it possible to switch between an S Corp and a C Corp?
Yes, it is. Generally, it is easier if I make that S Corp election first. And then as I grow, I just sort of undo that S Corp election. It is more difficult to go the other way. If I have been operating and treated for tax purposes as a C Corp, it is much harder to then make the S Corp election later.
Okay. So on an S Corp, do you pay yourself as a W-2 employee or do you 1099 yourself?
You can decide. It's not an operation of whether I'm an S Corp or a C Corp. It is sort of by operation of what am I doing for employment purposes, right? And do I meet, because employment versus independent contractor is a factor test that goes through the Department of Labor for each state. And so what you don't want to do is misclassify yourself, because then the business may incur liability for you're saying that you're a 1099 employee, that you're an independent contractor, but you're really acting as an employee. So there are a lot of it depends there.
Okay. With the LLC, do you file S, C, or what?
The LLC is a separate type of entity. So if I'm an LLC, I'm an LLC. If I file as a corporation, when I file, I will be a C Corp. And then if I meet the criteria of S Corp, then I file the tax document to make me an S Corp. But those are two separate things.
And then we had another question. So Joanna said they started out as an LLC, but I think that we should have done a different LLC and then acted as a doing business at, or should we just have two different LLCs? Joanna, you might want to pop on for that.
Yeah. It depends. I would need to know more information about, yeah.
So here's my question. So we have a boutique, but we also want to do like a coffee shop in the same building. So, but we would want to, so my thought is that right now we're Donna's Gift Closet LLC, and that's the boutique. My question is, as we add the coffee shop, that's totally different and not, it's not the retail, that's going to be under a different thing.
Right.
So should we be like the Galta's Sisters, like LLC, and then have branches of us as DBAs?
So probably two separate entities, because you're doing really different things, right? You don't want somebody who gets burned by coffee, for example, to be able to come after the assets of the boutique itself. So you can make those things separate. The next part, what do you mean about DBAs?
So we had one of our friends, they just said you might want to be like the Galta Sisters, like, because it's me and my sister that own these different things. And so their question was, could you just be the Galta Sisters LLC that governs over these different entities, or is it better just to have different LLCs, like the Donna's Boutique and then the Joe's Coffee Shop?
You could do either. My inclination is to do them separately, because you could have, and the question is, if the company that is sort of over both the other entities is continuously operating, you might want that as a corporation that owns these sort of subsidiary LLCs. But I'm happy to talk through that with you offline. So make sure you get in touch, because I think that has a couple different potential answers.
Awesome. Rose, you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you. I have a similar question, but I want to first say that I filed for an LLC 12 years ago. I did nothing with it, no EIN number, no publishing. Fast forward, I'm still interested in using that name. Is it possible for it to still be available for me to use?
So you haven't dissolved the LLC, correct?
No, I didn't. I didn't even go back into. So it would still be available for me to use?
So the good news is it still exists. It's still yours. If you haven't done anything with it, if you haven't operated, if you didn't have income come through that, then you're probably fine in terms of compliance purposes. But if you filed it in Texas, you may be able to see.
Oh, I'm sorry. I should have prefaced that. I'm in New York.
I mean, yeah, okay. When you said publishing, I was like, New York is like the only state that retains the publishing obligation for the LLC. So you may need to do the publishing portion of it in order to be compliant. But other than that, you should, since it has not been dissolved, it should be on the rolls still. And you can look it up on the New York, again, business website to make sure that it's still an entity, because you can do a search by name.
Okay. Also, I originally filed it for an event planning business. I don't want to do that anymore. What I want to do is have two separate businesses. The similar question as Joanne had. I wanted to have the LLC, but under their two businesses.
Okay.
Will I have to, or can I have two DBAs under the same LLC?
You can. You absolutely can have two DBAs under the same LLC. You want to consider whether, again, if you're doing two really different things, you may not want DBAs. You may want separate LLCs that are owned by the entity over it. So it's possible to have three LLCs. Obviously, in New York, from a startup standpoint, that gets expensive with publishing. But
Okay.
there are a couple of different ways to work it. I think if you're changing the purpose, you should go back and look at your original filing to make sure that you don't need to do an amendment to the purpose for the LLC, for the original filing of the LLC. But again, you should be able to see those documents through the New York website.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much.
And again, happy to talk through as you have more, more information about what those other things that you're trying to do under
Yes.
the main business are.
Yes, I
Mhm.
took your information. I believe you also practice in New York. Is that what I
Yes,
saw?
I do.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Thank you again.
Mhm.
So how important is the naming convention when filing an LLC, i.e. nickname includes i.e. name includes a space and was not filed that way? Should she refile?
Probably not. You may be able to just do an amendment to that. It's not a full name change. It's like, it's a filing amendment, and that is possible to do, to just get it to the correct format. So there are no issues. Sometimes a space won't make a difference unless somebody else is trying to come in and have a similar name, right? So there's an amendment rather than a refile.
Okay. I'm in the very beginning stages of starting a business. I'm not sure how I want to file, whether SP or LLC. Is it possible to defer my startup costs to the following filing year once I've decided on business type and have actually started making money?
Yes. Until you file, you are operating as a sole proprietorship.
Okay.
And so,
Bree, I
yes.
see you have your hand up.
Yes. Okay. So I'm a little bit of a generic question here, but I picked a really easy industry to get into. I started a liquor distributing company. Not a lot of laws
Easy.
there, but just, I mean, I have a great lawyer, but curious, any advice or any things I should be looking for that I just may not know about? I've been doing it about a year and a half.
Ooh. Off the top of my head, no. Every compliance issue that you may come up against, right? Make sure you're doing things timely. That's important. Interstate, shipping regulations, those are things that come up, obviously, you're probably very aware of. So those are the biggies, right? Different states have different prohibitions against sort of where you can sell and how much you
I
can
only
ship.
distribute in Texas, so I'm not going over state lines.
Okay. Yet. So say that.
Yet. Now I think I'll just stick with Texas.
Right. You're like, and there is enough compliance to deal with within the state.
Exactly. I know that was an open-ended question, but
yes. But you have a lawyer, and that is good. Right?
Yeah,
that is definitely an industry that it is tough to do it on your own and just think, okay, I'll be able to stay on top of it.
Yeah, he was with the TABC and just went into private practice this summer.
Then he's your guy.
Yep.
For sure.
He charges a lot, so I thought I would just ask if there's something else I want.
Okay, so we
Thank you.
have another question. The LLC is listed as a partnership. Company is spouse and spouse owned. What is the least expensive classification to file with the LLC, or should it just be a partnership?
So it is not officially filed as an LLC right now. It's just right now it is a partnership.
LaShonda, you might want to pop on for that.
Hello, it's Dr. Jackson Dean. Yes, it's already filed as an LLC.
Okay.
Both my spouse and I own it. And this will be our first time filing. I'm just want to make sure that I'm filing correctly, whether it should just be a LLC partnership or is there something else that would be a lot cheaper or inexpensive as far as taxes are concerned, how we can file. That's the question. I'm asking.
Okay. And
Thank you.
you're in Texas?
Yes, ma'am, I am.
Okay. So where you are or how you are filing as an LLC partnership is probably the best format, because again, it's passed through taxation. But, you know, obviously since both members of the LLC are spouses, it all sort of filters to the same place unless you are married filing separately versus married filing jointly. So you are probably in the best position that you could possibly be. Again,
No,
we're
we jointly.
okay.
It's not separately.
Yeah. So again, what I'm saying then is, even though you each member's income from the LLC is taxed to their individual tax returns, because you are married filing jointly, all of it's coming to you to your joint return anyway. So right now you are in sort of the best position in a state that doesn't have personal income tax. So that's a good thing. But again, I would always ask that you also consult with an accountant to make sure that there are no special situations that might change that situation.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And then we had a question further back that I missed. If I sell online to people from another state, do I need to worry about things beyond state sales tax?
Generally not, beyond the same sort of liability questions you would have in any, whether I was selling domestically to people. No, it really is, again, mostly sales tax collection. I guess the only other sort of concern, if something goes wrong, is it's that sufficient minimum contacts question. If something goes wrong and somebody decided to bring a lawsuit against the company in their home state, the state where you're selling versus the state where you are located, that possibly incurs additional legal fees. That's always a question, but again, for all of us, that risk is not significantly higher for an online business these days than it is for any business whatsoever. So sales tax is the main concern, to make sure that you're staying on top of that.
Awesome. Well, that's all the questions that we have in the chat. I will do one last call. We've got time for one more question if anybody has it. Going once, going twice.
Can she share her information again?
We'll send out the slide deck.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, absolutely. Do you want me to pop it up just for a quick second?
Sure, real quick.
You can do that or put it in the chat.
Yeah.
There it is.
Here it is.
Thank you.
Yep, absolutely. And again, you'll have access to this deck for reference as well. Everyone will.
Wow, Kelly, that was such great information, but a lot to really think about.
Yes, that's why you get the deck, because you don't have to memorize it all or get through it all. But I would rather give you more information than less information, so that you can make the best decisions, especially if you're just at the start of figuring out what type of business you should be.
Great. We appreciate it. It was really a great presentation and so important. Thank you for being here tonight.
Absolutely. And thank all of you for being here. Again, have a great Thanksgiving, and hopefully for most of us, rest of the week off. And good luck.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Good night,
you.
everyone.
Good night.
Good night. And
Thank
Donna,
you.
we have the next week then the Learn to Love the Numbers, financial fitness. So that will be the next in this series. So thank you everyone for being here, and we hope all of you have a very happy Thanksgiving.
Bye. Thanks, Kelly.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Kelly.